Welcome back to our channel, Early 1700s. Northern Plains Lakota bands along the Missouri River heard hoofbeats before they saw dust lift from the short grass. Breath rose white in the cold. Leather creaked. A lodge that once needed days to move could slip away before dawn and meet a bison herd at first light. Traders and messengers stitched south to north along river corridors. The horse rode those seams and turned distance into a choice. A mother packed a cradle board while scouts slipped out ahead. A boy learned to sit a pony before he could pull a bow. Elders counted range water and wind as measures that could save a camp. Screens of riders pushed the horizon outward. One hand sign on a ridge could swing a line miles wide. In the Black Hills and the Powder River, country trails braided and unbraided with the seasons. Along the Platte corridor and the Yellowstone basin, fresh grass and known fords set the rhythm of a year. Winter counts began to mark mounted raids and mounted hunts as the moments a story turned. Neighbors who also rode pressed from other directions. A fight could now begin where the Lakota chose an end before an enemy found the lodges. Mobility hardened into method. Herds were bred and guarded. Remounts were held back for the break. Horses drank in order and rested in shade cut for them with care. A mounted camp became a moving shield for children and elders, as much as a spear for young men. The horse was not an ornament. It was survival planned and repeated until it became identity. Time and place are fixed. Early 1700s to late 19th century. Missouri headwaters to Yellowstone waters. The question follows. How did the Lakota turn mobility into strategy across the northern plains? And why did that choice decide who could feed families, protect lodges, and control when a fight began and ended? In the century that followed, the first sight of horses, the northern plains changed shape. Traders out of French and Spanish outposts carried bridles, powder, and rumor upriver. Captive exchanges brought animals north one by one until herds began to appear beside the upper Missouri. The horse moved faster than the records that tried to count it. By mid-18th century, Lakota bands had crossed from the woodlands east of the river into open grass where herds of bison and herds of horses overlapped. Each crossing was both opportunity and threat. The promise was range and meat. The danger was collision with nations that had learned to ride earlier. Between roughly 1750 and 1800, pressure from the Ojibwe in the northeast and contests with the Arikara and Crow to the west drew the Lakota deeper into the plains. The horse made that migration survivable. Trade became the bloodstream of expansion. Post journals from Fort Pierre and earlier river depots show hides, guns, and horses moving in linked circuits. A family that held 10 mounts could join a summer hunt without leaving the old and the young behind. Horses carried teepees, poles, and meat. They multiplied the camp's reach across waterless ground. To protect herds, riders learned to camp in half circles with picket lines at the center. Children drove colts to graze before sunrise. Women plaited rawhide into leads and harness. The sound of bells tied to a led mare became the measure of safety at night. A sudden silence meant danger. Government pressure was still far away, but the logic of empire was already in motion. Trade in St. Louis and the Mississippi Valley sought routes westward. Fur companies wanted steady supply from the Missouri. Military surveyors noted the speed of mounted scouts they could not overtake. Treaties signed in distant rooms began to imagine straight borders across moving nations. Inside those lines, the Lakota were learning a different order, one remount, measured in grass water and days of travel. The horse joined diplomacy as well as war. A gift mare could open an alliance or seal a peace. A stolen stallion could start a campaign that ran 100 miles before a shot was fired. By the early 19th century, the horse had become currency weapon and memory. A man's wealth was counted in mounts and stories of rides. A woman's skill with tack and herd work kept the camp alive. Chiefs weighed decisions not only by numbers of guns, but by how many fresh horses stood tethered at dawn. The rise of the Lakota as a dominant force on the northern plains came not through a single conquest, but through hundreds of choices: when to move, when to trade, when to fight, and always how to keep the herds that made every choice possible. By the early 19th century, the rhythm of the plains pulsed through hooves and dust. Each season brought news carried on horseback, traders counting hides, couriers warning of raids, messengers inviting bands to gather for the great hunt. Mobility linked the Lakota world from the Missouri to the Powder River country. With it came new tensions. The Crow guarded their ranges fiercely. The Arikara held river crossings. Soldiers from expanding forts watched every trail. Skirmishes began, not as battles, but as meetings of scouts testing distance. One rider glimpsed another on the horizon, and the chase began. In those moments, the horse decided whether a warning reached home or vanished in the grass. Reports from fur traders describe camps stretching across miles, lodges arranged by bands so herds could graze safely. The sound of picket bells at dusk marked order. Young men trained for war by racing across river fords and circling back under arrows fired by their friends. Each contest refined control, how to lean, how to signal, how to keep balance when firing from the saddle. Horses were painted with symbols of their riders' dreams. Feathers tied to manes fluttered like moving prayers. The discipline was spiritual as much as tactical. In winter raids for food or horses, the dangers multiplied. Snow-covered trails and hooves cut ice that rang like glass. Riders wrapped buffalo robes around their mounts to hide breath in the cold. Success meant speed and silence. A diary kept at Fort Union in 1833 noted, Pierre Menard, Post Journal, Fort Union, Saust 1833. Before dawn, the Sioux riders passed the gate, no sound but the snow and the bell on one mare. When the light came, the corrals were empty. Incidents like these carried weight beyond their numbers. Each raid taught how far a herd could travel before exhaustion, how long a remount needed to recover, how weather could become ally or enemy. Communication grew faster. Smoke signals and mirror flashes reached camps 50 miles apart. With every success, the Lakota strengthened the invisible web that held scattered bands together. Mobility became a unity each ride, a lesson in how to live within vastness and still arrive exactly where power must be shown. The campaign season opened when grass rose high enough to carry herds, and when river ice broke into gray plates that drifted past the bends. Scouts rode first light along the Missouri headwaters and into the Powder River country. Their task was simple to say and hard to do. Find water, count lodges, read trails for fresh iron shoe cuts or the clean crescents of unshod hooves. They rode in pairs with a remount held by a thin rawhide lead. If one horse stumbled, the other ran on. The camp behind them began to lighten and then to move. Women broke lodges and coiled poles. Children gathered picket lines. Old men walked the edges and spoke to the horses as if to family. Movement itself was a shield. Distance becomes safety only if it is chosen before danger arrives. The first screen formed on a low ridge that overlooked a shallow ford. The trail down to the water showed the marks of many hooves and the dragged lines of travois poles. This was a known crossing. The scouts waited for the dust of the main body and then signaled with a lifted robe. Riders fanned into a crescent that matched the shape of the bend. The plan was practiced. Hold the ford, test the other bank. Do not spend fresh horses before noon. Keep 2 remounts for the break. Orders passed by gesture and by the short calls that every rider knew. The council had named the day for a hunt and for a warning. Reports placed a rival screen within a day's ride, and the camp could not be caught with lodges on the ground. By mid-morning, a line of Crow riders appeared on the far rise. They were where any good riders would be. The same grass, the same water, the same need to protect families moving behind them. 2 lines faced one another with the river between. Neither side wanted the first rush without knowing the depth of the water that would have to be crossed in retreat. A small group rode down to test the ford. Horses drank and blew. Men leaned from the saddle to feel the current on the end of a lance. The signal returned. Crossable today. not safe in flood. The dust above thickened where lodges moved. The screen held. Contact began, as it often did, with a feint. A file of Lakota riders slid down the bank and splashed across to draw a response. They wheeled short of the far slope and sent arrows high to read the wind. The other side answered with a short rush of their own and then checked. Both screens were feeling for an edge without paying a price, but in blood or in exhausted horses, the sound in the river valley changed with each swing. Hooves thudded in wet sand, then rang on stones, then fell back to the soft roll of grass. A boy on his first campaign felt his mouth go dry, while the old rider beside him breathed slow and kept a light hand on the reins. The lesson was always the same. Do not let speed choose for you. When the main body arrived, the line deepened. Remounts were moved under the bank and held in shade. Women took children and the oldest people to the back side of a cut bank, where fire smoke would not signal their position. The lead mare wore bells, and the sound of those bells settled the herd. A council of riders met under a willow. They spoke quickly and in order. The river could not be yielded. To give it up was to open a door into the camps and the game grounds beyond. The plan set a small force to cross above the bend under a screen of dust while the main line held the ford. If the enemy rushed the crossing, the line at the bend would press to fix them in place. If they held the ridge, the crossing force would take the high ground and bend the fight into a shape chosen by the riders who arrived first. The crossing force moved at a trot that did not waste air. The river above ran shallow over a gravel bar, and horses splashed quick and climbed the far bank with water running from cinches. The dust screen widened until it looked like a loose flock of birds. From the ridge, the enemy saw the shape change and sent a group to meet it. That draw left fewer riders to contest the ford. The signal flew. Now. The main line pushed forward. The first horses hit water, and then the next rank, and the next. The noise of the ford covered the calls, and the line rose out of the river in a mass that did not break stride. A rider on the far bank looked left and right and saw that a shape had closed around him that would not be easy to slip. Short orders were spoken then and remembered later because they were clear. Hold your breath across the stones. Change to the second horse at the willow. Do not chase a single man past the ridge. One fragment preserved the sense of the day. Hold the ford and keep your second horse fresh. Field order, Sidey River Bend, near Powder River, 1859. What followed was a fight measured in minutes and in short sprints. Men who tried to stand and trade blows found that the field itself refused. The first side to tire a horse lost space and then lost choice. Riders who kept a remount in hand could break contact and then return with speed, while their opponents labored to turn while blown. The dust thickened until even friends were only shapes and the sound of a known voice. Women moved the lodges again in case the line fell back. Children held the bell mare and spoke softly. A camp survives a fight by moving while the fight is happening. The screen on the ridge above the bend did its work. It bent the enemy line until it ran uphill to hold the high ground and then downhill to protect the families behind them. That curve opened a gap near a clump of cottonwood. Through that gap, a small group of riders drove hard and then wheeled right to cut return paths. It was a knife slice, not a hammer blow. They did not try to hold ground. They tried to make the other side choose between two bad choices: stand and be surrounded, or run and be cut as files crossed in confusion. Men shouted names to avoid striking friends in that press. Horses screamed as they brushed against each other, and the smell of sweat and river salt filled the lungs. Casualties were not counted in formal rolls that day. Those came later when traders heard numbers and when agency clerks tried to make sense of rumors. The best estimate is that few were killed and more were hurt. Such screens were meant to protect movement, not to destroy an enemy. The measure of success was that the camp crossed the river and the hunt could go on. Even so, any cut can go wrong. A thrown horse can break a leg. An arrow that finds a gap in a shirt can end a life. The old men counted those losses in quiet and added them to the winter count when the snow came. Through afternoon heat, the rhythm of the fight rose and fell. Short rush, wheel, loose file, short rush again. Remounts were switched in the wedge of shade under the bank, while two boys ran water from a shallow hole dug near the river edge. A healer smeared a paste along a girth sore and spoke over it. A man who had lost his mount took a rope from a friend and went back in on a fresh horse with a grin that was mostly relief. The line at the ridge held. The crossing force slid back down to the ford and took position on the far flank to prevent a counter-crossing in the dusk. The day had moved far, and the light had gone from white to yellow to low red. Near sunset, a last push came from the far ridge. It looked stronger than it was because dust rose in the low sun like smoke from a great fire. The line braced, and the first ranks bent without breaking. A single rider on a paint horse ran out in front and shouted a challenge that no one could hear through the wind. He turned tight and drew the enemy out of line for a moment. That moment was enough. The screen stepped forward to touch stirrups and then stepped back. The push failed. The dust thinned. People looked to see where their families had gone and where the herds were now being driven. The riders on the far ridge began to pull away in small groups. No pursuit was ordered. The goal was not a tally of dead. It was the freedom to move and to feed the camp. An after-action talk took place as the stars began. Men spoke in turn and used the same plain words they always used after a day that could have gone other ways. We did not burn out our best horses. We took the ford and did not waste it. We kept children and elders behind the cut bank when the line bent. A trader later wrote a short note that reflected the sober tone without hero speech. They came across in order and went back in order post note river post on the Platte corridor /1860. Fact and folklore often meet in this kind of story. Songs will name a single hero. Winter counts will draw a single horse against a circle of enemies. Those images are true to feeling and to memory. The day itself ran on many unnamed choices made by riders who held to discipline. Keep the screen. Switch horses at the right time. Do not chase anger over the ridge and into a trap. The difference between a proud song and a broken camp was often a rope tied on a second saddle horn and a drink of water given to a hot horse at the right moment. In late dark, the lodges went up again, beyond the next rise. Fires were small and set where their glow would not carry. Meat roasted and a boy fell asleep against a warm hide while the bell mare cropped grass within the circle of the picket lines. The river sounded different from this side. It had been an obstacle in the morning. Now it was a guard that separated the camp from the place where the fight had been. The horses rested with their heads low. Men spoke in low voices and did not boast. Women braided lead ropes for tomorrow. The plan for the next day was made simple because the day had been long. Move at first light. Keep the screen on the ridge. Cross the next water before noon. Let the herds graze on the north slope that holds green under wind. Far away, officers at a fort would later write about mounted speed they could not match and about scouts they could not catch. They would mark lines on maps that made little sense to people who measured the world in grass height, and in the distance a child could ride without fear. What the day had shown was not mystery, it was method. The Lakota made mobility into a system with parts that could be taught and repeated. Scout screens fords remounts discipline and choice. When these parts worked together, a camp could choose where to meet a fight and when to end it. That is what an empire of horses looks like in practice. It is not a court or a wall. It is a people who can move and who can protect that movement across a country that they know by water, by wind, and by the sound a bell makes in the dark. The turning point came when mobility became more than instinct and more than courage. It became coordination across distance, a knowledge shared between riders who might not see each other for weeks, but moved as if guided by one will. In the early 1860s, the Lakota held the Central Plains from the Yellowstone to the Platte, a range that frightened both traders and the new military surveyors. Each line of march that entered their country had to plan for riders who appeared vanished and appeared again miles away. The system had matured. Horses were bred for endurance, scouts were trained in rotation, and camps could split or merge with fluid precision. The empire of motion had learned to think collectively. That evolution is visible in records kept by soldiers who faced it. Captain Palmer, writing from Fort Laramie in 1864, admitted the scale of the difference. They move entire villages with the speed of our light cavalry, and their screens ride so far ahead that pursuit becomes guesswork. Palmer/Dispatch, Fort Laramie, 64. The statement was meant as complaint, but it reads as recognition. Lakota riders had turned mobility into a language, one that the Army could not yet translate. The rhythm of engagement now favored those who could exhaust the other side's horses before the main body ever met. Every encounter became a test of logistics disguised as a test of courage. Ammunition, grain, and grass decided outcomes more than bravery did. A command that arrived tired arrived too late. By the 1870s, new threats followed the old pattern. The railways, the telegraph, and the influx of settlers pressed in from all sides. Yet for a time, the horse still granted freedom. When pressure came, entire camps slipped away through coulees and high grass before dawn. Trails of fire and iron could not hold them. Mobility bought one last generation of autonomy before confinement and allotment orders began. The moment of full strength had already passed, but its logic survived. Control the range, control time, and you control the fight. The lesson was bitter for those who tried to measure victory only by territory held. The Lakota's strength was never a map line. It was the power to choose where to stand and when to disappear. In the end, that power could not be erased entirely. Horses remained in ceremony, in sport, and in song. The empire of movement contracted, but it did not die. It endured in memory and in the quiet hoofbeats that still trace the old trails when wind moves over the grass. When the long wars of the 1870s closed and treaties drew borders across the grass, the horse did not vanish. It waited behind the agency fences and along the river valleys where Lakota families rebuilt their camps. What had once been an empire of open movement became an economy of negotiation. Forts turned into agencies, scouts turned into interpreters, and horses became both the currency and the memory of a lost range. The reservation era began not with silence, but with the sound of hooves against frozen ground. Horses were counted, taxed, and sometimes seized. Each record that reduced a living herd to a number also preserved proof that mobility still existed, however confined. Agency ledgers from Pine Ridge and Standing Rock in the 1880s listed horses alongside kettles and rifles. Officials saw them as property. The people who lived with them saw them as proof that they still could move when the need came. Boys who were not allowed to hunt beyond the boundary still raced bareback along the fence lines. Elders told stories of the first crossings of the Missouri, of the long hunts on the Powder River, of the bells that once guarded the herds at night. They taught care and patience. Rub a sore with grease. Before it opens, water a horse before you drink. Never raise a whip in anger. These instructions carried a moral code older than the agency rules. Economics adapted. A good mare could be traded for tools or for food through the winter. Some families bred horses to sell to settlers or to the army itself. The irony was sharp but practical. To survive meant to engage with the same system that had tried to confine them. Women became the guardians of lineage, choosing stallions, naming foals, keeping the memory of color, gait, and spirit. On feast days, parades of riders moved through the new agency towns, the horses painted with the same patterns once seen on battlefields. Children laughed, and the elders nodded because the sight was familiar. The rhythm of hooves had outlasted the drumbeat of orders. Cultural continuance found other paths. In ceremonies marking the seasons, riders circled the crowd, 4 times each turn representing direction, prayer, and endurance. Horses carried flags in veterans' processions and later in rodeo grounds that blended traditional skill with public performance. Ledger artists, who had once drawn battle lines, now filled pages with parades and races. The horse remained central no longer as weapon, but as witness. Even in schools designed to erase language and ritual, children whispered the old horse words at night. They drew mounts in margins of English exercises and carved small figures from scraps of wood. To hold a horse in memory was to refuse erasure. Health and demography changed under policy pressure. The buffalo herds were gone and diets shifted to rations of flour and salt pork. Disease moved easily through crowded housing. Yet the presence of horses kept work and pride alive. Families gathered for communal branding and for the races that followed. There was laughter, wagers, and argument, the signs of a community still acting on its own terms. Mission reports noted the persistent attachment to horse events. The phrase was meant as criticism, but stands now as evidence of survival. Government programs in the early 20th century tried to replace communal herding with allotments and plows. Fields were measured, fences strung, and officials promised independence through farming. For a time, it seemed the horse might be reduced to a tool, pulling wagons for freight or turning soil for someone else's crop. But the animal had never been only utility. It carried identity, memory, and rhythm. When veterans returned from distant wars, Cuba, France, the Pacific, they found home again by riding into open land. The horses knew the trails, even when maps had changed names. By the mid-century, powwows renewed the circle of riders around song. Riders brought flags and eagle feathers, mixing military precision with ancestral grace. The young learned again to paint and ride in color. Photographs from the 1940s show proud lines of men and women in beaded saddles, their horses' gleaming tails tied with ribbons. The camera caught what no policy could erase: continuity in motion. In later decades, rodeos, endurance rides, and ceremonial journeys along ancestral routes carried the same meaning under new names. Every event measured not competition alone, but endurance through time. Modern programs at Pine Ridge, Rosebud, and Standing Rock continue the pattern. Youth camps teach horsemanship alongside language. The first words learned are often commands, and blessings walk turn thank you. Riders trace historic trails to remind each generation that distance once meant freedom, not exile. Horses from reservation breeding projects now win competitions across the plains. Visitors sometimes see only sport, elders see return. A horse still bends the land into a circle of understanding. To ride is to remember where you came from and where your people still live. Records in museums and archives preserve the earlier centuries in numbers and ink. Winter counts, post journals, and agency ledgers hold data horse tallies. Trade values distances covered in a day. Read together, they reveal a deeper story, one of adaptation and resilience. The Lakota did not lose the horse culture. They changed its field of operation from open grass to community memory and daily life. In ceremonies, in racing grounds, and therapy programs for veterans and youth, the rhythm of hooves continues to teach endurance. Each ride becomes a link between past and present, the living translation of survival. Even now, in the 21st century, a new generation rises at dawn to feed horses that stand against the same horizon their ancestors rode. The wind still cuts across the plains, carrying dust and song. They ride out not to reclaim empire, but to continue motion. Trails have fences now, yet movement itself remains sacred. The empire of horses endures not in conquest, but in continuity, a culture that turned mobility into memory and memory back into life. The story of the Lakota horse empire endures because it explains a deeper truth about survival. From the first hoofbeats on the Missouri banks to the present rides across the reservations, the horse turned motion into method and freedom into memory. Scholars debate dates and numbers when the first herds arrived, how far the raids reached, how many horses filled the northern plains, but they agree on meaning. The Lakota transformed a borrowed animal into a foundation of identity, law, and art. Every archive that lists mounts every winter count that shows riders in motion, and every modern race on the grass of Pine Ridge speaks to the same principal: movement is power when it serves the people who remember its cost. The northern plains still echo with that rhythm. The sound of hooves is both history and heartbeat, the measure of a nation that learned to live by distance, to survive confinement, and to carry its story forward on the wind. The story ends where the trail keeps going. Horses turn distance into choice and choice into survival. That is why this history still matters. What detail changed your view today? Which moment best shows how mobility became strategy? If you study Plains history, which source or map should we examine next? Tell us in the comments. We read every note and we add your leads to our research list.